There were some people of the very right wing who despised John F. Kennedy and everything he stood for. And unfortunately, one of the two papers, not the one I worked for, but the morning newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, was truly anti-Kennedy. And there were other people who supported that view in Dallas.
These great, phenomenal assemblies, whether they be headed by Dr. Francis E. Townsend, Gerald Smith, or Father Charles E. Coughlin, represent the unmistakable edict that is being issued to the corrupt, thieving politicians of America that the baby having, stump grubbing, sod busting, go to meeting, God-fearing American people are about to take over the United States government of America.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
This is John Potash, author of Drugs as Weapons Against Us. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 068, If This Be Treason, JFK versus the Far Right Wing. Our guest tonight is John Bevilacqua, who'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. Now, let's clean this castle a bit first, if we may. The donation button is still available on MidnightRiderNews.com, so if you'd like to help us out and support our mission, that's where you can do it, and we thank you so much. Now, the Midnight Rider News guest host, Rob Clark, has a new episode of the Lone Gunman podcast up. So he and Carmine Savastano are talking about organized crime in the JFK case. Now, Rob and Carmine do a nice job, and I know they would really appreciate your support. So that's the Lone Gunman Podcast. That's the Lone Gunman Podcast. You can do a Google search for it, and I know they're on Twitter as well as Facebook. Now, Carmine can be found at tpaak.com. That's tpaak.com. tpaak.com. And with that said, we'll be right back with John Bevilacqua.
Hi, this is Clara Bingham, author of Witness to the Revolution. For more on the radicals, resistors, vets, and hippies that awakened America in the year that it lost its mind and found its soul, listen to episode 41 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
John Bevilacqua is perhaps one of the very first JFK researchers in history. His research began on 11/18/1963, on the day his father, Lawrence, overheard a conversation amongst a group of persons speaking in Cuban Spanish in a house next door. That house turned out to be the CIA-sponsored safe house for Cuban exiles in the Miami area. Now, according to John, he had to put this JFK case on the back burner until about 1992 to avoid exposing himself and his family to undue risks of retaliation. Now, at that point in time, right after the movie JFK came out, he began his quest in earnest to discover those who were behind the plot to murder John F. Kennedy. His trail eventually led him to discover the relationship between two New Englanders who lived only about 25 miles apart, Wycliffe Draper and Anastasi von Siersky. He published a manuscript on Amazon, Kindle, and Nook about this 20-year investigation into the JFK case, and it's called JFK: The Final Solution. John appeared before the Assassination Records Review Board in Dallas in 1994 and has attended and participated in JFK conferences across America. Most recently, he's been a frequent poster and blogger on various JFK-related Facebook groups, and believe me when I tell you, you can't miss him. And no, I don't mean that in a negative way at all. John's a man who fully believes in this story, and he's always kind enough to take the time to explain it to anyone who's genuinely curious. Now, it is one of the more unique JFK assassination theories that you'll hear, and for many this will be the first time that you've ever heard the assassination spoken about in this way, on these terms, and involving these characters. So it should be an interesting night. So that said, this is John Bevilacqua. How are you this evening, John?
Doing all right, ST. How about yourself?
I am well, and thank you so much for being on the show. Now, John, you really have a unique perspective on the plot to murder President John F. Kennedy, and what we're going to talk about today is that angle. Now, we haven't really explored this story yet, so let's start at the beginning. Where and when did you first find this avenue of research, and what did you find that really sent you in this direction?
Well, originally I did sort of the classic research approach and independently discovered or revalidated people by Robert J. Morris from the Dallas John Birch Society, Charles Willoughby, Ray Klein, just a handful of people that had already been, discovered by a bunch of other people and were in the general consensus list of serious suspects. And then I picked up the novel, The Manchurian Candidate, by Richard Condon, and all of a sudden I started finding little hints that tied back into my original research and other people's original research, and some of it was very, very blatant, straightforward mentions of people like Gerald L.K. Smith, from the America First group and, the Hollywood 10, or it might have been Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., who was mentioned as that fascinating young man from Yale, who wrote about God and man at Yale. And I said, well, wait a minute. It looks like Condon has tied in to a bunch of the people I already knew about. And then he had a bunch of references to Robert Morris, at least 7 of them. One of them was like Major Dismiss, and that was an anagram, but it was a pretty obvious one. R.J. Morris is mad, or Hugh Bone was an obvious parallel to Jim Angleton's father, Hugh B. Angleton. And, he started accusing Hugh Bone of being a right-winger, a fascist, and a Nazi sympathizer. So I did research on his father, and I found out he was running the NCR franchise in pre-war Italy, and he was a big Mussolini fan. And David Mangold said, hey, both Hugh and his father, Hugh and his son were big fans of Mussolini, and they were essentially fascists because they had to be fascists. So it just developed from there, and then I started really looking for links to a bunch of the other people I had already found out about, or people I had run into by watching Chronoscope TV programs on CBS from the 50s. Or readings I did on the Warren Commission. Sure enough, Condon wrote about Revelo P. Oliver, who appeared before the Warren Commission. And it just, it took me over a year to fight my way through the Manchurian Candidate and pick out the people that I consider to be the dirty dozen. And the last 2 I found were also just very powerful and influential campaign operators throughout the 20th century from as early as 2000. From as early as 1924, when Sacco and Vanzetti were essentially shanghaied and electrocuted for a crime they didn't commit. And those two guys are Wycliffe Preston Draper from the Draper Company in Hopedale, Mass., and Anastasi Annie Vonziatsky, who was a former White Russian cavalry officer and one of Wycliffe Draper's strike-breaking goons when he first came over from Russia. And it just, the more I looked at them and the deeper I did the research on those two, I finally realized that, Wycliffe Preston Draper is the spitting image of Big Daddy Warbucks from Colonel Robert McCormick's comic strip, Little Orphan Annie, and of course, whether you pronounce Annie or Ani Vonziatsky had a lot of the characteristics of Little Orphan Annie. He was made an orphan during the Russian Revolution. Both of his parents were killed. He had the reddish hair. He always had a bunch of dogs with him, German shepherds, to protect him from any unwelcome intruders in Putnam, Connecticut, where he lived. And Wycliffe Preston Draper actually only lived 20 miles away from him across the border in Hopedale, Mass. So you'd probably agree this is a piecemeal but a convincing series of evidentiary items put together, would you not?
Oh, I absolutely would, yes. And it's interesting, John. One of the things you hear conspiracy detractors say is that the theorists spend too much time finding links and not enough time finding evidence. But I do think that links are important, but not on a small scale. But when links become so prevalent as to make them mathematically unlikely, then I think it starts to get interesting. And you've definitely found many links, so we're going to explore those today. But as I said before, it's a really unique perspective in that I don't know anyone else who is really talking about the case in this way and through the characters that you're going to describe to us. But I am wondering, why do you think you've been somewhat alone on this path? Who have you spoken with in the JFK field that also seems interested in this line of thinking?
Well, you have to go back to Bill Turner. He did The Fish is Red and Power on the Right, and Mae Brussel, and even Garrison to a certain extent. But Brussel and Turner were the very first ones who focused on Robert Morris, Charles Willoughby, the John Birch Society, and everybody who ran in that orbit around those two characters in what I call the left coast solution. It was sort of like the West Coast has been always ahead of the East Coast in their individual investigations and coming up with the appropriate conspirators. So it started with those two. And just recently, I saw something that Jim DiEugenio had published about Garrison saying it was militant right-wing extremist. He published it on the web recently, and I said to myself, I thought he was all CIA focused and CIA centric, and I didn't realize his original premise was, yes, he went after, CIA operatives and people with CIA connections, but his primary focus was always militant right-wing extremists. And Bill Turner worked for him for a while, and they both, attempted to do the California extradition of Eugene Hale Brading or Jim Braden. I can't remember which one is the real name and which one is the fake name, but they managed to get to Edwin Meese III, who was at that time Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, and Edwin Meese III ended up blocking the extradition after talking to Ronald Reagan and both Bill Turner, Mae Brussel, and Garrison said that really messed up their investigation into the radical right-wing extremists, and you know, everyone is pointing the finger at Angleton, and I was probably slow to get onto Angleton's case, but as soon as Condon was on the case for him and for Ray Steiner Klein, who ran his own little mini CIA, it's sort of like I may have gotten the first integrated conspiracy theory that was 50% CIA and ex-CIA and 50% DOD, and you know, I hate to call them ex-DOD because it makes it sound like a cop-out, but you know, literally you can't have a full-time job within the DOD with a bugged phone or a monitored office and participate directly in a plot. But people like Bonner Fellers, Charles Willoughby, and Douglas MacArthur, they had the benefit of being former DOD, just like Edwin Walker did, and they could run their own show as they wanted. And the core of the China lobby went back in the late 40s and the early 50s, right around McCarthyism, you know, with Robert Morris and Willoughby and MacArthur. And people forget that MacArthur and Willoughby were fired by Truman for attempting to cross over the Yalu River during the Korean War and start their own little war with China against anyone's wishes. It was like lack of gunboat diplomacy, but they wanted to just cause an incident, just like Dulles did, you know, attempted with Cuba and the Bay of Pigs. But this incident was literally supposed to cause World War III, and they had no compunctions at all about doing it. And they, you know, I even started digging into the origins of the Korean War by Bruce Cummings, volumes 1 and 2. And he made a very good point that his evidence showed him that Willoughby and H.L. Hunt from Texas ended up purchasing Korean soybean futures, millions of dollars worth of Korean soybean futures, knowing that they were going to cause an incident that would lead to, you know, the Korean War and cause the supply of soybeans to dry up, and they both became multimillionaires. I mean, Hunt and Willoughby would not have had that money unless they themselves staged an incident to cause the war. Now you got to say that's earth-shattering news that only showed up in one book in 1980. I think he wrote it.
Yes, but before we go into Condon's Dirty Dozen, so to speak, I'm going to give you as much time as you need to discuss each of them, I first want to discuss the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. Now, Paul Weyrich of the Heritage Foundation once said, quote, "When the roles of eugenics and the Pioneer Fund in world events are fully understood, all world history books written during the 20th century will have to be rewritten in full," unquote. That's a strong statement. So I'd like you to tell us about Weyrich and tell us about how this all relates to the eugenics movement.
All right. Sure. Paul Weyrich was basically, his main function was president or founder of the Heritage Foundation. And that was one of the multiple right-wing think tanks that were prominent in the 70s and the 80s and maybe into the 90s when he finally died. So he was well positioned, and he worked, you know, both for the Bush #1 administration, the Reagan administration. He was probably involved with Iran-Contra, and he was very well positioned to know the whole history of how eugenics started, who the head of the American Eugenics Society was, Wycliffe Preston Draper, and what their goals were, which essentially began probably, let me just think for a second when the American Eugenics Society came into play, probably in the late 20s and the early 30s, they blossomed even further when they managed to push a Supreme Court decision through Oliver Wendell Holmes. It was called Buck versus Bell, and it dealt with involuntary sterilization, because you know eugenics is like purity of the race, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, blonde, blue-eyed beasts, and kind of like Trump, anti-humanistic campaigns against those who might have physical defects, mental defects, inherited defects, even epilepsy. The eugenicists thought they could eliminate epilepsy as an inheritable program. So Wycliffe Draper managed to pass in, I think it was 36 states out of the 48 states in existence at the time, what essentially led to Hitler's laws for the prevention of hereditarily ill progeny. And I'm sure Trump would be very glad to pass similar laws if he could get away with it nowadays. But this led to numbers I've heard. Paul Lombardo from University of Virginia has written a lot about this. 76,000 American women were sterilized against their will, and all they had to do was bring them before a court of law, cite this particular law, and say that they were mentally retarded or showed signs of epilepsy or were essentially coming from a family of thieves, degenerates, and unemployed, and therefore they deserved to be sterilized. And no one fought them for the longest time, just because they thought they were do-gooders. The eugenicists, until they helped Hitler write his laws against the prevention of hereditary ill progeny, were very rich, welfare haters, Social Security haters, unemployment insurance haters, you name it, union haters. But in a way, they were the Rockefellers, they were the railroad barons, the textile barons, just the cream of the crop, who literally used to write books like White America, saying how America was losing its white majority, the white population was not reproducing enough, you name it, and their goal was through legislation, coercion, and even bounties to turn the tide of color back and to prevent immigrants from coming into the country, which is another way I compare Draper to Trump. Draper actually helped pass the Immigration Act of 1924. It's called the Johnson Immigration Act, which was eventually used against Jewish refugees trying to leave Europe after Hitler's onslaught had started, so they could come into the United States, and they were literally rejected and left to die in the concentration camps, because this law passed in 1924 was in anticipation of that sort of an activity occurring in Germany or in Europe within the next 15 years, and they just made that happen. So eugenics is worth an hour by itself. Of course, we don't have that time, but when you realize that Draper was considered the father of American eugenics, and Hitler was considered the proponent or the father of German eugenics, and a lot of it was kicked off in the 1936 Olympics. If you remember back, it was Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalfe trouncing, both of them were black athletes, trouncing the best that Germany and Europe had to offer in all the sprints and the sprint relays. and Harry Laughlin, who was one of the other founders of the American Eugenics Society, was actually present and watched Hitler scream and shake his fists and curse as Ralph Metcalfe and Jesse Owens beat back, the master race representatives. And even Draper, this is a little known fact, had a nephew by the name of Floyd Draper, who actually made the Olympic team, and he was scheduled to be the main sprinter on all the short-term sprints and the sprint relays. But he was not back in the ranks of the chosen athletes behind, Metcalfe and Owens. And literally, he won 3 gold medals, but it was only in the relays. He was an afterthought in the relays, and he wasn't the anchor, and he wasn't really proud. And it was right after the 36 Olympics that Draper started the Pioneer Fund with his own, investment and his family investment. And the Pioneer Fund, literally, I wish I had, cut out the full definition of the origin of Pioneer Fund, but their goal was to improve the welfare of the white race. They literally said the white race, and they started offering premiums to World War II combat pilots. For every child they had, that they would get a $10,000 bonus. They were later involved with the so-called Back to Africa movement, where Draper was actually paying a $10,000 bonus or premium for any blacks who voluntarily decided to move back to Africa. It's just a horrible, horrible story, but it became much more horrible and a much more realistic story when both the White Russians and Draper financed the rise of Hitler and allowed him to run rampant with his Holocaust and his concentration camps and literally the genocide, the attempted genocide of an entire race. So I think you can begin to see how critically important Draper was in formulating World War II and in propping up Hitler. So he became the largest mass murderer in history. This may be news to you, but you must be shocked to a certain extent to even hear about it.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm shocked. Not much really surprises me anymore, but I am quite enamored with the story so far. And you'll know more about this than I do, of course, but wasn't there an American Nazi conference or eugenics conference that took place at Madison Square Garden in 1939?
Yep. And I'm not positive if it was definitely a eugenics conference, but it was the rise of the radical right. In other words, people were saying things like if there was a Jewish reporter from the New York Times who sort of raised a question or said something controversial, they would all scream out, hang the communist bitch, she's nothing but a Jewish bitch. And that's when they started really linking together Judaism and communism as parallel, plagues. And when you think about the movie, The Manchurian Candidate, they I believe were emulating that Madison Square Garden conference in the scene when the mother of the assassin gets shot. When you think about it, there was no other, venue, that particular scene could have been meant to occur. And Gerald K. Smith was there. Gerald L. K. Smith was there. Every, what I would call, fan of Pat Buchanan's father. I can't remember the guy's name, but Pat Buchanan's father was obviously a fascist, just like he is. And all the individual writers who were already writing their propaganda in preparation for the Hollywood 10 and McCarthyism Brown versus Board of Education were present at that particular conference. And it was probably partially based on the America First Party and Gerald L.K. Smith's plans to nominate General Douglas MacArthur to be their presidential candidate in 1952. I think this particular Madison Square Garden incident happened right before or right after that 1952 campaign to have him, become a presidential candidate. And of course, Condon, by that time, had already started planning to write about these people. He wrote in 57 and 58 and published in 59. And a lot of people ask me, well, how did Condon figure this out? Which is a very good question, and I'm sure that was going to be on your agenda at some point. I actually discovered a guy by the name of Robert Condon, who was a member of the John Birch Society, and I haven't been able to determine if he was a father or a brother, but he lived in Dallas, and Richard Condon ended up moving to Dallas probably in the late 50s or the early 60s, and he lived in the Oak Cliff section right down the street from Mary Farrell, even though they never met and they never talked. But Condon, like a magnet, and I have to go back and check the starting date, either moved to Dallas right after the assassination or right before the assassination to probably start working even more closely with his brother or his father on this case. But literally, they used the core of the John Birch Society in Dallas, meaning Edwin Walker, Charles Willoughby, and Robert Morris, as the core of the novel, the core of their plot, and people like Bill Turner and Mae Brussel really didn't get onto Edwin Walker right away, but he obviously became a very important figure in this entire picture. And about 2 years ago, anybody can Google this, just do Edwin Walker and Charles de Gaulle Koch, I guess that's the way they pronounce it, because Edwin Walker's grandfather, his name was Charles de Gaulle, Degannahl, and literally the Gaunals gave the Koch family their financial start and their introduction to the oil business in Texas and turned them into billionaires. And lo and behold, Edwin Walker, who was part of that family, and he was inherited money, and that's why he didn't care if he got fired after the John Birch, the blue literature indoctrination he attempted against his troops in Germany. He lost his commission, but he didn't care. He just joined all the other people who'd been ignominiously thrown out of the military, like the Willoughbys, the MacArthurs, who was the guy, Gale, William Potter Gale, even Bonner Fellers. And they all became so mad at Truman and his policies and Dean Rusk's and Dean Acherson's policies, who were also in Truman's cabinet, that when they knew by 58 that Kennedy was going to be elected, and then especially after he was elected, and he hired Dean Rusk and Dean Acheson to be in his cabinet, they said, here we go, more lines in the sand. We want blood in the sand. There was even a book, I believe, called Blood in the Sand, and it compared the U.S. military's insistence on blood in the sand and forgetting 48th parallels, forgetting the North-South Vietnam, whatever it was, whatever river was dividing them. They said, we're not diplomats. We're sick and tired of diplomats and presidents, especially lieutenant and junior grade presidents, from telling us what to do, and we're going to take over all the military decisions. So that was the plan: get rid of Kennedy, increase the Vietnam War, and essentially take 50% of our tax dollars, like they're doing today, for the military budget. And you gotta admit that that's the most horrible plundering and rape job ever committed against the American taxpayer, wouldn't you?
Oh, I would, yes. Massive military spending for the sake of being overinvested globally is definitely not something I support. No, absolutely not. But I want to go back to something, if we may. About a month ago, we had Donald Jeffries on the show. Now, he's one of my favorite people in the field. And we talked about the assassination of Senator Huey Long. Well, as it turns out, the assassination is a part of your story as well. So how does this rise of the far right coincide with the assassination of Huey Long?
A lot of people don't know that his right-hand man in this Share the Wealth program was Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, who was also at the Winnipeg Airport incident and one of the primary formulators of the JFK plot. But somehow they had a falling out when Long went from a governor to become a senator, and I can't remember what turned Long against Smith, but he literally fired him outright. And Alton Ochsner was involved. Alton Ochsner's father from New Orleans was also involved with Huey Long, where Long fired Alton Ochsner from running a clinic somewhere around Tulane in New Orleans, or New Orleans, I guess this is the right way to pronounce it. And all of a sudden, Alton Ochsner Sr. was out of a job. Gerald L.K. Smith was out of a job, and they engaged in a conspiracy to essentially arrange for this other fake communist. I think it was Karl Weiss. Karl Weiss was Jewish, but not a communist, and essentially the bodyguards of Huey Long, who preferred the Smith and Ochsner politics to Huey's, were told what was going to happen. This guy Karl Weiss would show up, and he was going to attempt to assassinate Long. Let him do it, but in fact there were some bodyguards who didn't know the plan, and they started firing wildly. And people still argue which bullet killed Huey Long and which bullet killed Karl Weiss. But the net result was a trumped-up fake communist was chosen immediately on the spot as the perpetrator and murdered on the spot, like Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to be. And Huey Long was dead, and Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith took over the Share the Wealth program, got the mailing lists, took over Huey Long's job, and Alton Ochsner Sr. got his job back as head of the clinic. So when you hear the name Alton Ochsner Jr., who once was head of the Council for National Policy, just like Nelson Bunker Hunt, Edwin Meese III, there's another guy who got a reward for trumping Garrison's investigation. They all became leaders of the Council for National Policy. Tim LaHaye was another one, but those are the names. The names I just mentioned were the ones that were best known as having contributed something. Pat Robertson, Reverend Pat Robertson, contributed something to the Kennedy assassination. And Pat Robertson's father, a lot of people don't even know this, it's in my manuscript, he was the other, not the other, but he was one of the senators from Virginia at the time, and he also hated Senator Long. So it's kind of like you look at the heads of the Council for National Policy and you go, holy cow, every one of them, it's like the Crips and the Bloods. You've got to kill a politician or contribute to the murder of an opposing politician before you get to be head of the Council for National Policy. And so I'm going, everyone, Pat Robertson's father, and I'm sure he may have had something to do with Kennedy's. Alton Ochsner, he was part of Inca. He knew Pat Frawley. Robert Morris worked for Pat Frawley out of California. Nelson Bunker Hunt, we all know his father was H.L. Hunt, and I agree, and 80% of the other investigators agree he was involved. But I call it the Council for National, as in Nazi policy. and you can find them on the web too. I don't know, but that's the story, the long and the short of it, for how Smith was asked to get involved with a strategy for the Kennedy patsy job with Lee Harvey Oswald. And I'm sure he said, well, here's what we did with Huey Long. It worked then, and I'm sure it's going to work now. And he was one of the main architects, and eventually attended the meeting, the Winnipeg Airport incident of February of '64, recent murderers of Kennedy who were discussing going to Wichita, Kansas to pick up the payoff. And whose headquarters were in Wichita, Kansas? The Koch family, Rock Island Oil and Gas, and all their other various holdings, including now Georgia Pacific, the lumber company down in Georgia. And the next destination, already discussed at the Winnipeg incident, was to go to Wichita and have another meeting and basically divvy up the profits and then continue with their plans to expand the Vietnam War. So are you ready for the story about how Draper got his payoff from killing Kennedy? Have you come across that yet?
Oh, I have, and I am, but in just one moment, John, because I'd like to ask you first about the rise of the right. Now, I think there's this perception out there that the rise of the deep state occurs largely during the Eisenhower years, which are 1953 to 1961. After all, in his farewell address, we know that he warned us about the acquisition of unwarranted influence, that's unwarranted influence, and then said that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So he is kind of laying out what he sees happening. But he says because of that, we were asked to remain vigilant in our monitoring of what Ike then termed, the phrase we all know, the military-industrial complex. But you write about not just one, but two coup attempts against FDR. So how did the deep state attempt to drive FDR from the White House?
Oh, yeah, exactly. The plot to take the White House. Exactly, yes. Yeah, one of them was formulated in 1936 at something called the Asheville Conference, attended by William Dudley Pelley, who was eventually on the America First Committee, which was essentially just a smokescreen to keep the United States out of war against Germany and against Hitler, because they wanted Hitler to take over Germany and beat England. But the Asheville Conference, I don't know if I said it, but Gerald L.K. Smith was there, and a bunch of these other demagogues of the Depression and the whole right-wing Southern coalition, which was sponsored by, who was it? The J.P. Morgans, the Chase Banks, all those, industrialists who already had picked a savior or a replacement for FDR, whose name is escaping me right now. The plot to take the White House.
I believe that was General Smedley Butler.
Major General Smedley D. Butler. He was the one in the 33/36 plot. Yeah, the Asheville Conference had decided on General Smedley Butler to be the replacement for FDR, and it was going to be a military coup. They would either put FDR in jail or murder him outright, and they picked this guy Smedley Butler because of his impeccable credentials in all the Banana Wars and in World War I, and leading a campaign to raise the income for military veterans, but it failed because Smedley Butler refused to take any part in it whatsoever. He turned the louts in, and there was nobody around who was willing to press charges or to get involved. It's kind of like the same whitewash of the Warren Commission, when people didn't want to run the risk of getting themselves murdered for investigating real, true conspirators. Smedley Butler stopped the coup d'etat and helped support FDR. going forward. But in fact, nobody ever went to jail. And it's called The Plot to Seize the White House by Jules Archer. Anybody can read about it, but it was a popular topic back in the 90s when I attended a conference in Cambridge, Mass. A lot of people started talking about it then and saying the Smedley Butler plot was an almost identical clone to the JFK plot, except this time the military succeeded. They won, and they got rid of a sitting president. And the one you were talking about for the mid to late 40s had a bunch of right-wing senators like Burton K. Wheeler, which you mentioned, from one of the far western states. It may have been Montana, as you said, and a couple of other people, even the other members of the America First Committee, like Trump's new America First Committee and the America First Plan, all saw that the war wasn't going well, and they had to try to do something to arrange another coup, and that one never came around. There was a lot of talk, even an American swastika was discussed, but the fact that FDR, had what was the disease he had that confined him to the wheelchair? I guess it was
he had polio.
Polio, right? And they figured he was going to die soon anyway, and that plot never materialized, but it was like very close to the second attempt against FDR, and it almost succeeded, but since all the military was so busy fighting World War II, they couldn't get any support from the military to help pull it off. But you're right, it's just a constant battle, right versus left, and when the right doesn't get its way, it brings in the military and it brings in the extremists that they can hire to target their unfavored politicians. And whether you used, B1 Bob Dornan from California to legislate or pick out legislators who were, against the military, or whether you did it through threats and blackmails or campaigns, whatever method, was required, the right was able to get money from the Koch family, from the Draper family, from the H.L. Hunt family, from whoever it was, to target particular politicians for defeat, so they would slowly but surely get, year after year of Republican Senates and Republican houses to pick their wars and to pick their campaigns to transfer money from helping humans in need to helping the military, get new equipment and new tools and more soldiers to wage their wars, against the rest of the world. And it's continuing here. I mean, you'd probably agree that to go from 20% of the federal budget for the military to 50% or 55% is a travesty against humanity, wouldn't you say?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's outlandish for any country to have a perpetual state of war. And I wondered about what Eisenhower's farewell address meant to you. It's on YouTube for anyone interested, and the most vital lines are also in the opening montage of Stone's JFK. But in your line of research, John, the road you're taking, Eisenhower's comments must be colossal red flags.
Oh, that's absolutely. As soon as I first saw it, probably in the as related to the case in the early 90s, the military-industrial complex speech was literally a warning to the world that he had let it get out of control, that he was an acceptable general or a favorable general only because he gave them too much rope. And now he was saying, now that the industrial DOD defense contractors had come into the picture, he was losing control or losing any way to rein in both his generals, like Curtis LeMay and Lyman Lemnitzer, he could take care of them pretty much. Kennedy had trouble with both of them. But ultimately, one of my other major breakthroughs in this whole case was when I came across a New York Times article, which is summarized in the manuscript, that said Rockwell International takes over the Draper Company from Hopedale, Mass., Department of Defense contractor for $100 million. And I said, well, wait a minute. They were almost out of business. I mean, when you look at, well, first of all, that was the first news that the Draper Company was really considered a military DOD contractor. And then all of a sudden, I talked to a guy named Dan Malloy out of Hopedale, Mass., who runs a website called Hopedale1848.com, and he told me, he sent me articles that Draper's profits, even though they were only textile loom equipment manufacturers or manufacturers of various items of apparel, their profits spiked during the wartime. That's why, number one, he was called Big Daddy Warbucks. It turns out that he or his customers essentially made uniforms. They made military uniforms. They made the blankets. They made saddlebags. They made ammo packs. They made bandages. They made flags. They made pennants. They made tents. I mean, when you think about it, even burlap has to be sewn from cotton or wool and canvas in order to become useful as a tent or a cot or a body carrier or body bags, you name it. When you think about it, they made, or their customers made, all the soft goods you can possibly imagine that were needed in times of war. And Bruce Cummings even accused them of making the fake Korean uniforms that Willoughby used to dress up South Korean soldiers in North Korean uniforms, and then he murdered them and called it an insurgency, and that's what broke out the Korean War. So in essence, there was a reason why Robert McCormick started the a comic strip called Big Daddy Warbucks and Little Orphan Annie, and it was because the Drapers only during times of war had spikes in their profits. So they just turned it around, and once they were bought by Rockwell, they essentially made sure that there were more spikes in world wars, which would result in more profits coming to them. So it's like a vicious cycle. I mean,
well, let's go to Richard Condon's Dirty Dozen, as you call them. Now, after the JFK case had really sunk in, and especially after the RFK assassination in June of '68, more and more references were being made to Condon's book, The Manchurian Candidate. Now, this was the case more so with Sirhan than Oswald, but then there was also Condon's more blatant work of 1974's Winter Kills. Both are very good stories for anyone out there. You can probably buy them on Amazon or your local bookstore. But Condon, you believe, absolutely knew something. So much so that you've compiled a list of 12 figures that you believe he references in the work. So let's go through the list, and please tell us how each ties into the Kennedy assassination story.
All right. Okay. In not necessarily alphabetical order, but I'm going to start with the two most prominent CIA representatives who were on the American Security Council. And that would be James Jesus Angleton and Ray Steiner Klein. I probably don't have to spend too much time on James Jesus Angleton because, everybody by now knows his background, having been born in Mexico to a Mexican mother, and his mother's involvement in Los Tecos, which was a part of the World Anti-Communist League, and having Jim being appointed to the Warren Commission liaison to the CIA. I mean, his fingerprints are just absolutely all over it. And of course, his father, Hugh Angleton, was also referenced, and that would make the 13th once we get through with this list. And Ray Steiner Klein was at one time voted head of the World Anti-Communist League right in the Iran-Contra days, and the years surrounding that, when the World Anti-Communist League, based on a book called Inside the League by John and Scott Anderson, was published to show that this was the first conscious effort to get anti-communists who were really pro-fascist from, I think they had something like 86 member countries, planning and plotting together to do whatever was necessary to bring down the Iron Curtain. And that was as early as, well, they had the Asian Pacific Anti-Communist League, the North American World Anti-Communist League, and even Guy Bannister's Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean, as early as 60 and 61. So now all of a sudden, you have the first formal body that meets twice a year to do nothing but plan on how to bring down the Iron Curtain. And they finally all agree that in order for that to happen, Kennedy had to die, and the Vietnam War and succeeding wars had to be expanded, and you'd have to eventually come up with a president like Ronald Reagan, who would go to the Iceland, the Reykjavik summit, and demand, bring down Khrushchev, whoever, I don't think it was still Khrushchev, but, Russia, bring down the wall, bring down the, Berlin Wall, bring down the Iron Curtain. And that led eventually to both of those events happening within like a 1 year period. Both the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain came down. But interesting sidelight about Ray Klein. People should research a guy named Julius Amos, who was a independent millionaire who essentially used to run probably 10,000 individual agents behind the Iron Curtain who would feed him various information. I mean, he and work various dirty deeds done cheap on his behalf. He even found a Polish aviator or a Polish pilot who was willing to fly a Russian MiG over the Iron Curtain and landed in West Berlin and turn over the MiG to the Americans so they could analyze it and figure out what it could and could not do to help neutralize the Russian MiGs. But Ray Klein was like, he started in Tunghua, China, very close to Harbin in Manchuria, where George de Mohrenschildt and Anastasia von Zyatsky lived out their diaspora after they were thrown out of communist Russia, and literally worked with people like Robert Emmett Johnson, who was a U.S. Marine who had undergone mind control and programmed assassination techniques. And many people say Robert Emmett Johnson was one of the actual shooters in Dealey Plaza and was an ex-Marine, just like Oswald. So that's the first two were the CIA, affiliations. The next three are all what I call China Lobby / John Birch Society, / McCarthyites, and that would be Robert J. Morris, Major General Charles Willoughby, and General of the Army's Douglas MacArthur. And people say, well, I don't remember seeing Douglas MacArthur in the movie, or he wasn't mentioned in the novel. And I said, well, you're right. He probably wasn't in the novel, but he in the movie, Frankenheimer and Condon decided to put him into two portraits. And if you review that movie, you will see cameras panning right to the portrait of Douglas MacArthur over, an assembly of soldiers in a tent while this dramatic music is being played. And add to that Dick Russell's informant literally implicated Adolf Chuppy Wiedenbach, which is the name used by Charles Willoughby when he was born. He was born in Germany, and he changed it to Charles Willoughby to anglicize it and become more acceptable. But But literally, there's no doubt about it that MacArthur was in the movie, but not the novel. And Willoughby was implicated by Dick Russell, as well as Mae Brussel and Bill Turner. And Robert Morris is in the same category. He's like Mr. Big. I mean, when you come down to it, you look at Robert J. Morris in the Miami plot, where his father owned a winter home, and in the Dallas plot. In both cases, he lived very close to Jack Ruby. A lot of people don't know it, but Morris lived like 6 doors down in Dallas from Jack Ruby, and Robert J. Morris lived 4 doors down from me in Miami in Grapeland Heights. And he was the only one who touched all across the board, from the China lobby, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, the McCarran Committee, the Office of Naval Intelligence. He was credited with being the real brains behind McCarthyism by not Webster there. I'll think of his name, but in his obituary, he's credited with being the real brains behind McCarthyism, because McCarthy was just an adult, from Wisconsin. He wasn't all that important, but Morris was involved in the American Security Council. He was on the Chronoscope TV show, which you can still download from CBS. He worked for Patrick Frawley Jr., on that Inca group, and he worked for Technicolor in California. And he was literally, he and Willoughby were head of the Dallas branch of the John Birch Society. And that to me is like the popular front, or the political front for the American Security Council. So Morris eventually will be recognized as the single linchpin, followed by Willoughby, and with the backing and the support of Douglas MacArthur. So that's 3, 4, and 5. Any questions or comments on those 3 guys?
I do have one, yes. Now, I understand that MacArthur was angry about having been fired by Truman in April of 1951, and he was probably angry at having been replaced by Ridgway. And maybe he was even working behind the scenes with some faction in order to potentially attain a presidential nomination. But how does that tie General Douglas MacArthur to the Kennedy assassination?
Through his proxy, Willoughby was his G2, head of intelligence, throughout World War II and Korea. So MacArthur was living in the Waldorf Astoria towers. He probably made millions on soybeans. But the real front man who joined the groups and did all the bidding of MacArthur and Morris was Charles Willoughby. So it's like you can't say MacArthur ever joined a group and lobbied, for the Vietnamese War. He probably did behind the scenes, but Willoughby was the guy. He was the front man. So MacArthur was perfectly willing to let Willoughby and Morris do all the work, or Edwin Walker, or the other guy from the Constitution Party, William Potter Gale. They were all former MacArthur generals. They fired all the MacArthur generals. So he had at least 5 fired and disbarred former generals or colonels of his doing the dirty work. So you got to look at Willoughby and Morris and those guys with appointment.
All right. William F. Buckley.
All right. Number 6 was William F. Buckley Jr. and his buddy E. Howard Hunt. I think they were godfathers for each other's children. And Buckley, essentially, even his father has a history going back to General Pershing and Pancho Villa, when his father lost the Buckley oil wells to the Mexican rebellion or some Mexican revolt. And there were 3 people working for Pershing to go after Pancho Villa and to turn back the revolution and recover the oil properties. And those were George Otis Draper, who was a major, Charles Willoughby himself. A lot of people don't know that. Buckley's father knew Charles Willoughby. They both worked for Pershing. And Hugh Angleton. And Jim Angleton's father was also in Pershing's army. So you talk about, well, you didn't spend too much time on the early, 20th century military roles, but one guy, Gordon Winslow, said, "So you're saying the JFK plot started in a campfire while going after Pancho Villa?" And I said, "Well, not exactly, but it was like these three guys, kept going after insurgent people of color for their entire lives." I mean, you look at Skull and Bones and William Buckley. I mean, they literally claim to have Pancho Villa's head, Geronimo's head, and my guess is they might even had JFK's brain for a while. But Buckley is the symbol of the Skull and Bones Society, and I Willoughby wasn't a Yaley, but I think Angleton's father was a Yaley. And George Otis Draper was a Yaley, and Wycliffe Draper was a Harvard grad, and they literally made plans to go after banana dictators and any insurgent like a Geronimo or a Pancho Villa or whoever else they decided to go after. Even Alger Hiss was not a person of color, but they went after him and framed him as well. So not much more has to be said about Buckley or Hunt. Except the fascinating fact I found out, 3 people who attended Brown University who all had a link into the Kennedy assassination. E. Howard Hunt was there for his undergraduate years. Anastasy Vonziatsky was there to learn English as a second language. He used to drive from Putnam to Providence, which is a distance about 30 miles, in a 1936 Pierce Arrow, dressed in a Nazi uniform, to watch football games and tear down the goalposts. And the last one was George Lincoln Rockwell was also at Brown at the same time, and had to have met Anastasy Vonziatsky in a Nazi uniform. And my theory is Vonziatsky gave him the money to start the American Nazi Party. Okay. So number 7, just before we get back to Big Daddy Warbucks and Little Orphan Annie, was General Bonner Fellers. And I accidentally discovered an amazing fact about him. First, I saw him on a Chronoscope show, and I said, "Man, he's just like Robert Morris, another McCarthyite, another ex-military man, just talking about, expanding military presence, increasing the funding, and getting rid of liberals, same old garbage." Well, Fellers was stationed in Cairo during World War II. And you think it's an innocent enough thing. He's in Cairo, Egypt. It's not really a war zone. But all of a sudden, someone said, "Oh, Bonner Fellers received daily, communications from Montgomery in northern Africa about his British tank movements, and he immediately passed them on to a young James Angleton in the Rome OSS office." And I said, "What? Fellers to Montgomery, and from Montgomery to Fellers to Angleton? I know sure as hell Fellers sent the tank movements on to Erwin Rommel, who was a supposed desert fox for the Nazis, and he would show up and outflank poor Montgomery. And in fact, Erwin Rommel was no desert fox. You cannot possibly, without air surveillance, which he didn't have, figure out what Montgomery was doing unless you had inside information. A lot of the movements were happening overnight. and Montgomery would wake up and he'd be, surrounded or confronted with German tanks. I'm dying to do some FOIAs, but I'll guarantee you that was the way that Erwin Rommel became, an infamous desert fox. So what Fellers actually did within the Kennedy assassination, out of the 12, he's like the only one I'm not even totally positive about, but there was an anagram about Bonner Fellers, CI, counterintelligence, something like, Nazi lover. Yeah, I can't remember the exact one, but just the fact that Condon put him in there, he had to have some role. And I just apologize for not knowing exactly what it is. But Are you ready? Are you ready now for Big Daddy Warbucks and Little Orphan Annie?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
And I'm still trying to go back the real tie-in that convinced me, not only the physical resemblance between Wycliffe Draper and Big Daddy Warbucks, right down to those little pince-nez glasses and the U-shaped bald pate, the fact that Draper was stationed in India during the Great Bengal Famine, during World War II, and he had a manservant, not named Punjab, but I mean, I used to wonder why the heck Big Daddy Warbucks had an Indian manservant who still spoke with an accent, and now I figured it out. Draper was a colonel in an observer, and during World War II, and he was the spitting image of the guy. Plus all the backing came from none other than Colonel Robert McCormick. Now, you'll probably recognize the name McCormick as the McCormick Reaper. Do you remember what the McCormick Reaper was?
I do, yes. It's a combine.
Yeah, it's a wheat combine and a series of other equipment that Cyrus McCormick invented. He came from that family, International Harvester, and when the Russian Revolution took over Russia, they had thousands of International Harvester McCormick Reapers on loan or on, time payments to the Tsarists. Mm-hmm. And the Tsarists made the payments, but as soon as the communists took over, the downslide of International Harvester and the whole McCormick family fortune started to begin. So Colonel Robert McCormick owned the Chicago Tribune, and he decided that this Big Daddy Warbucks would be, the bootstrap entrepreneur, an anti-communist, a secretive sort of detective who went after all the bad guys. I can't remember all the other features, but obviously his Big Daddy Warbucks was someone who made spikes of profits during the war. And almost everybody on this list of Condon's Dirty Dozen had some sort of thing to gain by bringing down the Iron Curtain. And that's the one thing they all shared together. They were all working together either through the World Anti-Communist League, through the American Security Council, through the John Birch Society, through comic strips from the 1920s and the 1930s. Whatever it took, their goal was annihilation of the Red Russians and restoration of the White Russians, and that's one of the reasons that von Jatsky was called the Manchurian Candidate. He was the candidate from Manchuria who was chosen to be the Russian fascist dictator or ruler of a restored Tsarist state. He had hundreds of millions of rubles in his possession that were now worthless, because of the Russian Revolution. But some of the other things I've found that Wycliffe Draper did, and just a quick touch on the Raleigh phone call. Wycliffe Draper's right-hand man in 1995 was exposed by none other than Roy Hargraves to Mary Farrell in a private phone call as working for Wycliffe Draper and being the Dealey Plaza organizer of all the shooters, and then another professor told me, well, yeah, he killed this guy. I can't mention his name now because I got to check with the attorneys, but he was the guy who had the Mississippi Freedom Riders killed, and he was the guy who organized the Birmingham Choir Girls explosion, and he was the guy who had Medgar Evers shot. And so as a hunch, I knew this other guy was from Raleigh, North Carolina. In 1995, I called his business and I said, "Is John Hurt available?" And they go, "Oh no, Mr. Hurt hasn't worked for us for, oh gosh, must be 10 or 12 years now, and I think he's dead by now. Why do you want to talk to him?" Oh, nothing. I just wanted to just wanted to find out if he's still alive. A friend of mine knows. I made up some baloney story, but for all intents and purposes, this means that the Raleigh phone call was made to John Hurt. Yes, he was a former Army intelligence person, but his boss worked for Wycliffe Preston Draper from the 60s until early 2000, early to maybe 2010 when he finally died. So it's like this was like the first time I hadn't even worked on the Raleigh phone call for very long. I made one phone call myself to Raleigh, and I figured out who John Hurt worked for, and it's a gigantic breakthrough and a gigantic piece of information, and it just further cemented Wycliffe Preston Draper as being one of the kingpins for all the things that he did. And what else did he do? Holocaust laws, American Eugenics Society, FDR plot, the JFK plot, purchased by Rockwell International, Back to Africa movement. I mean, like Paul Weyrich said, this guy did something. Even Alger Hiss, Wycliffe Draper did something about every 10 years that had a major effect on world events or a major effect on politics. And he was like drunk with power. He was just drunk with power.
So were you saying that it was Hurt or Hargraves who was the organizer in Dallas?
Oh, no. It was Wycliffe Draper's vice president of the Pioneer Fund, who was the organizer. Roy Hargraves mentioned him by name.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Mary Farrell goes, well, who shot him, Roy? Who shot him? And he just said the guy's name. And Mary goes, have you ever heard of this guy? I said, no, I never have. I'll do the research for you. And I found him in a book called The Coors Connection. That's all I can say right now. If anybody wants to buy this little $10 paperback called The Coors Connection, he's mentioned there. And I might even tell you guys that he also was a big shot in the Council for National Policy, being one of the Crips and the Bloods. You don't get to be a big shot in the Council for National Policy unless you kill a bigwig. So I can give lots of hints, but I may have to just get final clearance from my attorneys before I can say it. But, just like MacArthur relied on Willoughby, Draper relied on this character to do all his little dirty deeds. And Roy Hargraves was the one who pointed him out. I probably never would have looked at this guy, except for the fact that, all 10 leaders of the Council for National Policy are murderers or were murderers. I may have eventually said, well, who did this guy kill? I may eventually have come on him, but Roy Hargraves gave it all away. And the sad story about Roy Hargraves, and David Giesbrecht can confirm this, after I called him and mentioned this guy's name, Hargraves goes like this on the phone. He goes, who did you say? And I repeated the name, and he goes, oh, no, I don't know who he is. Within 24 hours, he changed his phone number, he moved, and he was never seen or heard from again until he died. He went into hiding, and Dave Giesbrecht, Richard Giesbrecht's son, can confirm that. He never wanted to be associated. I didn't know it would have that effect. And I didn't want to make the guy go into hiding, but literally he disappeared from the face of the earth right after Noel Twyman had interviewed him, shortly after that. So I apologize for that, but...
No, that's okay. When you get the clearance, you can come back on and give us the scoop. That'll be fine. Now, there are so many ties to this story, but one that you refer to in your work, one that I think will interest our audience, is the tie of Anastasi von Syatsky to George de Mohrenschildt.
Yes. This is beautiful, okay? And again, this came through piece by piece by piece. As I'm reading the novel, I'm going, let me think if I knew about him a little bit, or if I didn't know much about him, or if it was an introduction. But someone called me up, a friend of mine from New Jersey, and he said, did you know that George de Mohrenschildt lived in Harbin, Manchuria? Did you know that he met his wife, Jean Legon, in Harbin, Manchuria, and that he was part of this gigantic Russian diaspora where all the former, Tsarist cavalry officers and Tsarist white Russians lived for 30 years trying to sabotage Russia? They sent in programmed assassins to kill commissars. I said, really? Programmed assassins? So I can't remember what first started me looking for an anagram about Anastasy von Zyatsky, but I started looking, and it's documented. You'll hear this, and you'll say it sounds crazy, but it was like because you had a lot of Z's, you know what I mean? You had a lot of crazy letters, and the anagram is in the manuscript. It's known as Yastas, Fravashi, and Amisa Spentus, and that comes out to Tsar Anastasy von Zyatsky, dawn phase fascism. And I go, dawn phase of fascism? What the hell does that mean? Well, guess what? Now I know what it means. Now I know what it means. And Charles Hyam wrote about von Zyatsky and said, Anastasy, in an American swastika, Anastasy von Zyatsky was the leader of all North American Nazi spies. I said, Georgie boy. Everybody's always called him and his brother, Dmitri, were known as Nazi spies. So I said, man, that guy is big. And then somewhere else, they used to have a website called the Order of St. John, okay, OSJ. And many people carried the OSJ designation. Angleton was really a knight of the Order of St. John, or the Knight of Malta. Bill, I'm trying to think of his name, one of the CIA heads, people like John B. Trevor, who was on the Pioneer Fund and the American Coalition of Patriotic Societies. He was head of the OSJ. So this OSJ thing comes right back down to Ani von Zyatsky. He was literally the head of the entire Order of St. John. He was in the Russian Orthodox, Catholic Church. He started this order. It was had a history going all the way back to God only knows, czars and czarinas and Napoleon. And he was their knight on a white shining horse, their main hope to recover their lost homeland and all their lost money and power and their friends. And he basically, the clue was, once I knew he was from Manchuria, I figured out what Condon meant by the Manchurian Candidate. And once I learned that de Mohrenschildt was there for years, and that they dealt in sending programmed assassins, either suicide assassins or hit-and-run assassins, back into Russia to kill commissars, I said, my God, that's it in a nutshell. And George de Mohrenschildt, you know what his war name was? Philip Harbin. And that's the guy in New Jersey who called me. And that means I love Harbin, because they had no choice. They had to love Harbin, Manchuria. There were over 100,000 white Russian czarists who had been kicked out of town or had to run out of town for fear of being killed. And they all went to Harbin, Manchuria, and the Japanese occupation forces accepted them with open arms. It wasn't even, owned by China at that time. It was more friendly Japanese, occupation forces. So.
And now we're down to the final three of Condon's Dirty Dozen.
All right. We've got, I got just Reverend Gerald L.K. Smith, and, you're right, three. Revelo Oliver and Major General Edwin A. Walker. So we've touched on a lot about Gerald L.K. Smith. I mean, he's the only double murderer, Huey Long and JFK. And his highlights, if you remember the Hollywood 10, trying to frame up producers and Hollywood producers, Hollywood writers, and Hollywood directors as communist lovers, was his campaign, the Hollywood 10, but Draper paid for it. He was seriously involved with McCarthyism, the America First Committee. He was involved with William Dudley Pelley, who did that Asheville Conference. Just an out-and-out demagogue. He was a demagogue of the Depression, and he never stopped being a demagogue, along with, who was the other guy? Shoot, I can't even think of him.
I think you're referring to Father Charles Coughlin.
Coughlin, right? That's another guy. And who was the third one?
It might have been Francis Townsend.
Yeah, Francis Townsend, I think, was the third one. Yeah, Francis Townsend. Yeah, but you're right. Coughlin was one of them, making radio shows, saying, don't fight the Nazis. They were all cut from the same cloth, and they were the first religious right-wing extremists who were anti-communist, and they did it to be a buck, and they ended up being pro-fascist because they were paid by the fascists. And Smith actually attended and set up the Winnipeg airport incident. He was a dead ringer for David Ferry because of his eyebrows and his eyes. And I got a picture of him that looks just like David Ferry. So this guy Peter Whitney insists it was Ferry, but it was Gerald L.K. Smith. Is number 10. And 11 was Revelio P. Oliver. Now I'm going, Revelio P. Oliver gave testimony before the Warren Commission. How the hell did Condon know in 58 and 59 that this guy, who was a founder of the John Birch Society, would end up, being involved with the Warren Commission? He knew he was had something to do with the Kennedy assassination. And I actually found on his website a whole rendition of the tour of southern Canada that one stop was in Winnipeg, and it was the Winnipeg airport incident. So I said, that proves he was involved with the post-assassination activity, and showing up in the Manchurian Candidate in 59 is pre-assassination information. And the fact that he used to say things like, to prove that he's a Nazi, he in 66, he was in front of a John Birch meeting in the Boston Esplanade off the Charles River, and he dared to say something like, I had a wonderful, glorious dream last night. I woke up after dreaming that all the Jews in America had been vaporized in a pogrom.
Well, it's not really the most pleasant.
And I was so sad when I woke up and I realized it wasn't true. Yeah, you can Google Oliver as well as, Boston, Esplanade and Jews vaporized, and it's still all over the web. And this guy was, best way to describe it, part of the Church of the Creator, which was another one of those right-wing radical churches run by a former Tsarist Russian who's now a fascist, who was working, for whatever goals they were working with. But Oliver was like one of the most rotten, foul-mouthed idiots you're ever going to meet. And his website still has speeches. You got to just go listen to Revelio's speeches. They're unbelievable. But that's his tie-in. The number 12 was Edwin Walker, and he's sort of an afterthought to the other two heads of the Dallas John Birch Society, meaning Morris and Willoughby. And I kind of added him as a third leader in the triumvirate, just because of what he did. You remember the Old Miss riots against the integration movements, right?
I do, yes.
Yeah. Handful of people died. RFK jailed them for 60 days in a psycho ward, in the same psycho ward that Anastasi Wonziatsky was jailed in Springfield, Mass. I thought that was ironic as hell. And the recent book by Jeffrey Caldwell, the doctor who wrote the book about Edwin Walker, added tons of other pieces of information about Walker, but he meets the paradigm of being ignominiously fired by Truman or Kennedy. So you look at four of these people and, just being fired for his Munich, Germany, pro-Birch, pro-Blue, John Birch indoctrinations, put him on the JFK hate list. And the fact that he tried to implicate Oswald after Oswald was dead for that April potshot story, the fake potshot story. It's like, why the hell would you wait that long to make up this story and further implicate Oswald, you know? And the only thing I found so far in the book, in Manchurian Candidate, was this reference to Turtle Creek Drive. And I said, I just read it, I stored it away, and then all of a sudden, boom. Yeah, someone went to Walker's home on Turtle Creek Drive and took a pot shot. He claims they took a pot shot and left a bullet in his window. And I said, shoot, no one else would mention Turtle Creek Drive unless it was important to remember. He may be in there another time, but the newest breakthrough on Walker was the Ganal family of the Koch brothers. Walker's grandfather was a de Ganal he was an Austrian Nazi, came over and for some reason gave Kochs the money to start their oil business in Wichita, Kansas, Rock Island Oil and Gas. And people had linked the Koch family long before this link, to Walker in the Kennedy assassination, because I can't remember the actual reference, but when you see that one of the three Koch brothers is named Charles de Ganal Koch, and that's like a dead giveaway that they're very grateful to the de Ganal family for giving their start in the business. And the Koch family was involved with the formation of the John Birch Society. They put up a lot of the front money, and to this day, I will maintain that they were some of the money provided behind the scenes for the JFK assassination. That's the dirty dozen.
Now, you've alluded to the Raleigh phone call a few times in the telling of this story, but I really want to focus on it for a few minutes if we could. So please take us through the story of the Raleigh phone call. What is it, and why is it important to the Kennedy case?
Okay. Basically, when Oswald was in jail, I guess even then they had the rule, you get one phone call and only one phone call, okay? So he gave two phone numbers to the operator there and said, please call collect, ask for John Hurt, tell him I'd like to speak to him, whatever, I'm not even sure of what other language was added behind it, but this was his one phone call. So you know how important the Raleigh phone call was. And for some reason, well, probably for a pretty good reason, someone in the Dallas PD or the Secret Service or somebody said, well, tell him you tried and you couldn't complete it. Or, with some bogus excuse. It rang 2 or 3 times and, I don't know, I guess there were no answering machines, but the call was never completed. A lot of research was done, and I'm stumbling on the name. He's a Dr. Grover Proctor, was the one who did most of the research on the call and said, well, John Hurt, I found out, was former Army intelligence, and this was Oswald's rescue call. This was like the person he was supposed to meet in the Texas theater. This is the phone call he had in his his address book that he was supposed to call if he got in trouble. And Proctor thought that this guy had to be a current employee of the U.S. government, and everybody else said that too. Oh, definitely CIA, or maybe he was Army Intel, but he could be CIA. But this was a person he was told could get him out of hot water. So make sure you make the call when you're in hot water. And obviously he was in hot water. and Grover Proctor just left it there. And he hasn't returned my emails, my phone calls, anything else. He doesn't want to entertain somebody else, I guess, meddling in his story or his rendition. But I kind of sat back, and I didn't even look at the Raleigh phone call until 95 or 6. I was like 5 years into my serious investigative period when all of a sudden, boom, through Roy Hargraves and miscellaneous pieces of information, I realized that the person Roy Hargraves was pointing the finger at was also from Raleigh. He was close with Jesse Helms. He was close with Nelson Bunker Hunt. All of a sudden I said, well, shoot, maybe, just maybe, the only guy I know in Raleigh was somehow involved with John Hurt. So I mentioned it earlier. I said, what's wrong with just calling, finding out, where this guy works, what his business is, making a phone call and asking for John Hurt. I know what they're going to say if I ask for the guy. I know he worked there, and I know he worked for Draper. So I did. I just said, I talked to John Hurt. I don't want to repeat the whole story, but basically, Mr. Hurt used to work for us, but he hasn't been here for years, and I think he died 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah, he did die 10 or 15 years ago. In 81, and my call, if I remember correctly, was like 95 or 96. But that was all I needed to know. I hung up the phone shaking. All I could ask him was, "What did he do for you?" And they just mumbled something like, "Well, he was an investigator, or he was did special projects for us, blah blah blah, whatever it was." So basically, I put down the phone with my heart beating and my hand shaking, and I'm saying, holy cow, this is so big. And I'm digging more and more into Roy Hargraves. I don't know if you're on all those Facebook sites, but they just released 55 documents on this blackvault.com with the keyword Roy Emery Hargraves or Roy Hargraves in them. And let me tell you, Roy Hargraves is linked by the FBI to the Martin Luther King story, to the JFK story, to the South Florida Soldiers of Fortune stories. He was even asked if he would go to Guantanamo and fire some torpedoes or rockets into Guantanamo so that Operation Northwoods could use that as an excuse to invade Cuba. And I'm going, holy shit, this guy was such a psycho. He would do anything for a buck, and he was a total vagrant. He was even arrested for vagrancy. He's one of Gerald Patrick Hemming's, right-hand men, in Interpen. And I'm saying, I wish I had, broadcast the hints about Roy Hargraves earlier, because he's more violent than Hemming, more reliable than Hemming, and he only talked to Mary Farrell. And if Mary Farrell, God rest her soul, should get the full credit for solving this Raleigh phone call. I mean, I just went through the motions. I just followed the leads wherever they led, and I pegged this guy when matter of fact, I knew in advance that he was a Draper guy, he was a Pioneer Fund guy, and he was a Council for National Policy guy. I said, please God, let this lady, on the reception desk, be nice enough to just help me out. And no one's had coached her. She didn't know how to react. She was just trying to help. But I put the phone down shaking. I really did. And unfortunately, he was still alive. I think he lived till 2010 or 12, and I was just too chicken to mess with him. I mean, you wouldn't mess with him, would you?
If he was really responsible for everything that you listed earlier, no, I would not. Now, another number that we know Oswald had in his phone book was FBI agent James Hosty. He'd interviewed Marina upon their return to the United States from Russia, and then Oswald had written Hosty a letter supposedly protesting the harassment of Marina, his wife. But then that letter was destroyed and obviously never reported. So Hosty goes on to write the book Assignment Oswald, and the rest is history. So did you come across Hosty at all in your research?
Oh, yeah. I didn't tell you the Hosty story. I'm pretty sure that's either on the web or in my manuscript, but it's my personal encounter with Hosty. And he also was involved in investigating the Winnipeg airport incident. So when he published his book, I just look at the bottom. People say, oh, how did you get his phone number? Oh, you must be CIA. I said, no, I'm just, aggressive and smart and tricky.
And those things always help.
But I found the publisher, and I said, hey, my name is Joe McLaughlin, and I'd love to do a review of Mr. Hosty's book. Have you got his phone number? Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Here's his phone number. Give him a call. So I called him up on the same ruse, doing a review, and I go to the Winnipeg airport incident. I said, oh, how come you didn't mention the Winnipeg airport incident? Weren't you involved with part of the investigation on that? He says, well, yeah, I was. I said, what if I told you I could tell you who the Ukrainian accented 6'6" guy with the, the burns on his scalp, the hearing aid, the pock marks on the back of his neck, who he was. How are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? I said, well, you ever heard of Anastasi Vonziatsky? And he goes, it couldn't have been him. I said, what do you mean? Well, no, it couldn't have been him. He probably wasn't even in Canada at the time. So he knew everything about the guy and had a ready-made alibi. He absolutely knew who the guy was, and he spent 2 minutes trying to talk me out of it, that I had identified the guy from the Winnipeg airport incident. And then I asked him one question, like another tricky question, and he went silent. And I go, what's the matter, Hosty? Cat got your tongue? He goes, are you recording this? I said, maybe. Well, my manager wanted me to record the interview. Well, if you're recording this, I'm all done. Thank you very much. Boom, and he hangs up. So a lot of people don't know he was involved in the Winnipeg airport incident, but he obviously had become the go-to guy for, deflecting interrogatories into the case. And I honestly don't know the details of the notes.
And on to the Winnipeg airport incident, which is really the third key point of what you do, the first being Richard Condon's Dirty Dozen, and the second being the Raleigh phone call. So what is the Winnipeg airport incident? Who was involved, and why is it important?
All right. Brief summary. A guy by the name of Richard Giesbrecht, who was either a traveling life insurance agent or, a special agent for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and I'm thinking he had more than just an interest as a life insurance agent in this conversation. Was in the airport, Winnipeg airport restaurant and/or bar, and he was minding his own business, sitting up against the window, and then all of a sudden he starts overhearing snippets of a conversation among 4 or 5 men. And one guy talked really, really loud, like people with a hearing aid who can't really hear themselves. So they talk too loud so that they can pick themselves up on their own hearing aid. And he was taking notes. He started taking notes and took notes about the appearance of one particular individual who had 7 characteristics shared by Anastasi Vonziatsky, and Bill Turner told me, you only need 5 for a good ID. What are the 7? And I go, okay. He had pockmarks on the back of his neck, and I found out he formerly had boils on the back of his neck by reading The Russian Fascist by John Stefan. He was wearing a hearing aid, and he had a machine gun shooting gallery in his home in Putnam, Connecticut, which is only 30 miles from my home. And he shot in a chicken coop, which had only 7-foot ceilings, and he obviously didn't wear any earplugs. And during the Russian, Civil War, or whatever you want to call it, the Russian Revolution, he was a cavalry officer, and he once got knocked off a horse by an artillery shell that landed near to him, and that certainly would mess up your hearing. He had burn marks on his scalp. Then I found out in the same book, Russian Fascists, he used to hustle down to Providence, and his barber every spring or late winter gave him a razor scalping by a straight razor to knock off his winter growth and essentially give him razor burns, which would made him show up for Richard Giesbrecht as burns on his scalp. He had freckles on his hands, freckled hands. He was about 6'5" or 6'6" inches tall. He had a heavy Ukrainian accent. And, I've learned to recognize Ukrainian and Russian accents, and I can understand that. And Hosty even admitted he had a Ukrainian accent. And what else? That's about it. A little bit of broken English still, even at that point, he was probably 64. So Giesbrecht couldn't identify anybody else. Later on, he did claim he thought one of them was David Ferry, but I kind of debunked that with the Gerald L.K. Smith lookalike. So he goes to leave, and they follow him. They like saw he was taking notes and listening and, learning too much. They follow him around the airport, and he tried to go to like a security office in a hallway, and they blocked the door. They wouldn't let him go to the door. So he ran around some more and finally evaded them. Somebody had to catch a plane. But he did see him walking out as a group to get in a plane called World Airways. And it turns out that World Airways was owned by none other than Claire Chennault, General Claire Chennault of the China lobby. And it was a quasi-military transport plane, but it was a great way for anybody to fly in and out of a city for surreptitious meetings when they didn't want to have a plane ticket that could be traced. So bottom line is he reported as many of the facts as he could, and he said they had discussed a company that he didn't remember the name of the company, but he remembers that it sounds like it would have had something to do with textiles or cloth or some product you make out of textiles or cloth. And I'm going, oh, could be Drapes and Draper. Maybe it's Drapes and Draper. Wouldn't that be nice? And I started piecing that together, just like I had pieced together the Richard Condon novel. And they said they were planning to go to Wichita, Kansas, right afterwards for a meeting and for distribution of funds or sharing of funds. And there were a couple other, interesting little pieces, but basically the main thing I found was, again, the key to Anastasi von Ziatsky, and Hosty denying it like a mad dog. And I started Googling, not Googling, but because this was probably also 94 or 95, but researching a lot of Birch books, and I found a reference of Gerald L.K. Smith went on a tour of southern Canada in February of 1964 with Eric D. Butler from Australia, who was another, Eric Butler was like the Gerald L.K. Smith of Australia, and they had never had met before. And also attending the meeting were Patrick J. Walsh of the Canadian Liberty Lobby and Ronald A. Gostick of the North American Regional World Anti-Communist League. And I said, holy shit, I'll bet you that's the meeting that they went to in Winnipeg. And I didn't know what the meeting would have been in Wichita, Kansas. But I'm thinking it was either the Constitution Party or it was Rock Island Oil and Gas or something related to it. And Wichita was like the known headquarters of this other religious right weirdo, Gerald. I'm trying to think of it, but this guy was known as the Jayhawk Nazi. And Kansas City is known as the Jayhawk State. Gerald B. Winrod. Yeah, it was Reverend Gerald B. Winrod, and Gordon B. Winrod was his son. And they published the American Mercury, which is another, no time to do it today unless you've got the time to do it. But the American Mercury was where Bill Buckley got his first job. American Mercury was like, Human Events or National Review, whatever you want to call it. It was like the worst anti-communist rag. It started as a legitimate publication, but that was being published right in Wichita, Kansas, by these Winrod guys, the Jayhawk Nazi. And I mean, anytime you're being called a Jayhawk Nazi, the whole press and the whole state knows who you are and what you are. But that's the long and the short of it on the Giesbrecht incident. It's like 2 of my 12 were there, and the other 2 guys were involved with Liberty Lobby or North American World Anti-Communist League, which are also very high on my list of organizations that conspired to do in JFK. But you'll see in the manuscript, the Winnipeg Airport incident is about 5 or 6 pages. Condon is like 60 or 70 pages, single spaced, and all the other related details. But It's when you can go at a crime in three different ways. After means, motive, and opportunity. If you can find 25% of your suspects or condemned suspects involved with every aspect of investigation and every angle you can think of, you know you're onto something. You absolutely know you're onto something, and that's what I feel is the strength of my approach. It's like, however you look at it, a handful of Condon's dirty dozen were present and accounted for in all aspects, in all venues of investigation.
Now, in your research, you talk about the interviews that you conducted, and you talk about one informal interview that you had with one person specifically, that person being Marina Oswald. Now, I want to know what happened with that and what she told you, but I also would like to know what that tells you about Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yep. I only had a chance in Cambridge, probably mid-90s. Harvard was doing a badly publicized conference, but in attendance were Daniel Ellsberg, Marina Oswald, just basically a non-standard conference. Like Ellsberg, I don't think ever showed up at another conference. I know Marina is always flooded, or what do you call it, pinned in a corner and quizzed when she shows up. But there was a break in the proceedings, about a 15-minute break. I'm outside, just in the hallway, and boom, along comes Marina. And I go, oh, this is beautiful. I want to ask her a couple of things. I only got like one or two questions in. I said, Marina, can you tell me something about that incident where you supposedly pushed against a bathroom door in order to keep Lee inside so he couldn't go out and either take a shot at Walker or, let me think, what was the other guy? Oh, Nixon or something. Can you tell me how that happened? How could you push on a door that opens into the bathroom when all he had to do was step back and pull the door open and you would go flying, or something, I phrase it like that. She says, no, I don't remember that. This never happened. Who told you that this thing happened? And I said, well, that's the way Igor Vashinin and Ilya Mamontov translated your testimony. I said, did you ever read your testimony in the Word? No. I have never read this. It's too much. And I know that Igor, Mr. Vashinin, who was eventually going to be her biographer, was the only one who knows both languages. I mean, back then I could try to read, the Warren Commission, but my English was not so good. So how could I read the Warren Commission in English if my English was not so good? That is the reason they had a translate. I said, well, that's what he said, and everybody's blaming you as if you're the liar, right? Or you're the fabricator, or you're making stuff up, making them look bad, blah blah blah. And she says, well, no, this never happened. And then I maybe gave her a quick question. Did he ever admit to you that he fired the shot at Edwin Walker? Oh, no, he never did this. He never said this. I'm going, and then she goes, well, excuse me, they're starting up again. I have to go in. And I went, wow, that's like, my major theory was if Vashinin and Mamontov were the only two people who were bilingual and nobody recorded the proceedings that they were translating, and literally, I think they were like, how did it work? Yeah, they were verbally pretending to translate, and the stenographers were taking down only what they translated, but of course they couldn't take down what Marina said. It reminds me of, I don't know if you ever saw this, but poor Robin Williams used to do a funny skit with Russian gymnast. He was asking her, he was pretending to be both the interviewer and the gymnast, Olivia Korber or whatever it is. I can't remember which one was. And he would ask her an innocent question, And are you enjoying America? What do you do for fun? And then he imitates her smoking pot and doing sexual innuendos of hip movements and carrying on. And then he goes to then he translates it. She says she is enjoying it very much. She is getting lots of exercise and smoking American cigarettes. And I'm going, wait a minute, that's not what she did. She's not getting exercise. And he was funny as hell. But that's the first time it occurred to me that Voshinin and Mamontov translated her testimony any way they wanted to serve their purpose. And Voshinin was a white Russian. He may have even been a petroleum geologist. He was from Dallas. And Mamontov was the same thing. White Russian fascist who made Marina look like a liar. And when in fact, she probably, all the lies were probably coming out of their mouth. You know what I mean?
Well, yes, definitely. And I've never quite known how to feel about Marina, but being intentionally mistranslated in a case like this is just really sad. And you write quite a bit about the Catholic Church, the Order of St. John, the Knights of Malta. So was there a Catholic angle to this conspiracy? Because it would seem somewhat curious to me, especially when JFK was the first Catholic president.
Yeah, well, you have to start with Order of St. John having 3 or 4 countries and 3 or 4 different branches. Russian Orthodox Catholicism. Vonjatsky got married in a Russian Orthodox cathedral. Order of St. John, I actually think not only James Angleton carried the OSJ moniker, Philip J. Corso carried the OSJ moniker, and 7 out of 10 of the first CIA directors were Catholic. All right. So I used to joke about the Catholic Intelligence Agency, and then I used to say, well, in reality, Vonziatsky and de Mohrenschildt were Catholics, and Paul Weyrich was a Catholic. He was from Georgetown. Morris went to Fordham and Catholic University. Otto F. Otepka, who was the director of security, passport security, and the number one honcho in the passport office, and he would have been the one who ferried Oswald from country to country in record time without any question, and even let him back as a fake or as a real defector into the United States with no questions. Who else? Ray Klein was Georgetown and a Catholic. Angleton, I said, was Catholic. And much of the World Anti-Communist League, you look back again, you go, these are all Catholic countries. They all lost or will lose, lost something to communism. I grew up a Catholic, and I know Polish freedom fighters. I knew my father was a Hungarian freedom fighter. My grandfather died during the Hungarian Revolution when he got run over by a tank and both legs were broken. I understand Cuban freedom fighters; they're all Catholic. I'm kind of going. At that point, they hated Kennedy so much they didn't even care he was Catholic. All he cared was schools are being closed, nuns are being raped, property is being taken. The Catholic Church is losing the ability to pursue their primary directive of conversions and collecting cash, collecting cash at the when it's time when they do a Dominic Go Friskum, the guy goes out with a basket, right, and collects the money. So half a joke and half seriously. But even Spellman, I found one thing. Francis Cardinal Spellman. Oh, Hunt was a Catholic. E. Howard Hunt. Francis Spellman was the one who prevailed upon E. Howard Hunt to go to Arbenz of Guatemala and try to convince him to step down before he was taken down. So So Hunt is talking to whatever, Cardinal, or I used to was Cardinal Francis Spellman. Hunt, who works for the Catholic Intelligence Agency, is approached by Francis Cardinal Spellman to go talk to Arbenz before he, I said, that is fucking powerful. I'm sorry for the language, but that is amazing. That is powerful stuff. So I said, even though Wąsiowski, didn't kowtow to the Pope in Rome, Angleton and Corso worked for the OSS in the Rome office. So the popes were all in touch with Angleton, and Corso admitted he worked for Giovanni Battista Montini, who was a papal nuncio at the time, on making a decision about how to treat German or accused Nazis coming through Rome looking to get to the United States. And in a Jupiter newspaper, these little things I find, I never freaking forget. You're noticing that, probably.
Oh, I am. But John, I'm stuck on a name here. Now, you mentioned Philip J. Corso. Is this the same Philip J. Corso who authored The Day After Roswell?
Yes, he's a maniac. Wow. He's a total maniac. And that's the same Corso that John McCain criticized for claiming in a congressional hearing that Ike left POWs back in Korea. He said, "Sir, I can't think of a word to describe you, but what you're saying is utterly preposterous and blah, 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 blah." But Corso was one of these mind control storytellers who wants to see what kind of BS story he can put together. And you know what he told me about these bad guys who came through the Vatican? Well, I would tell Giovanni Battista Montini, we want this guy, we want that guy, and he would arrange to let him out a private door to an alleyway. I would show up with an MP Jeep, probably a fake MP Jeep, and I would whisk him away to jail. And then my answer was, bullshit, you put him on the express boat to Argentina. So Corso accidentally admitted he was the last guy who saw controversial ex-Nazis and people who wanted expatriation through Rome because they were Catholics, and he was the one who sent them on the Grace line, Peter Grace.
Well, it would sure be interesting to have known if Corso had any information on how Eichmann got to South America, or had any information regarding whether or not the Catholic Church actually helped in that exit from Germany.
Yeah, did anybody ever say that Eichmann went through the radar rat lines? I think Montini, he became Pope Paul VI, but Montini was no match for Angleton and Corso and all those CIA guys, who could tell him anything. We want that guy. We're putting him in jail. I'll be there with an MP Jeep 9:00 tonight. Just escort him out there, and he'll think we're helping him, and we're gonna punish him. Well, that is the secret of the rat lines. Faking out a papal nuncio and getting him on your side, thinking he was sending them all off to jail or to get hanged. And that's the game. Even let me hear this one about Oswald. Again, Gordon Winslow, through Hemming, said, this Maurice Bishop shit stuff, how do you think Cubans pronounce Morris? Morriss. They pronounce it Morris. No, they pronounce it Maurice. And I said, Hemming said that? Yeah, Hemming said it. You can go on the web. Hemming said to Jerry Rose and John Newman that he honestly believes that Maurice Bishop was Robert Morris Bishop. And I know Robert Morris spent winters in Miami because I used to try to mow his lawn. I used to try to, sell him newspapers, whatever that may be. And he was just the nastiest bastard on the whole block. So both of them, Gordon Winslow and Jerry Patrick Hemming, think Maurice Bishop was really Robert Morris, and I tend to believe him too. So just a bunch of little well-researched tidbits, some personal and some third-party, research and literature. But the one thing I'm glad I never did was to read all that early speculation that focused on the fact that three people first tried to blame the Cubans, then they tried to blame the Russians, then they finally blamed the CIA. And those three people were Gerald L.K. Smith, Revelo Oliver, and probably Philip Corso or Robert Morris. So these people went through a litany of potential scapegoats until one stuck. And I still think it's a shame that Garrison's original premise of militant right-wing extremists, or the Willie Somerset and the Miami PD, Joe Miltier from a high building with a rifle, people just never focused early enough. Henry Gonzalez did the same thing. You remember him, the representative from Texas? He said right-wingers, John Birchers. I mean, Ruby said, Edwin Walker, and the people who are trying to impeach Earl Warren, or what do you call it, Judge Warren, the same people who hate you and Edwin Walker and the John Birch Society who hate the Jews are the ones who killed Kennedy. Now, who would know better than Ruby? And everybody put him down. They put him down. Oh, he's crazy. Pogroms, anti-Semites did it. Fascists did it. Walker did it. He can't even make up his mind. Birchers did it. Come on, Ruby. The CIA did it. Why don't you say the truth? Well, he would have said the CIA if he had any proof.
Well, you've laid out a case for us that it was the far-right wing of American thought and politics, but this doesn't really answer the Lyndon Johnson question. Being vice president, he was who you were going to get if or when Kennedy was assassinated, and he was. Now, Johnson's obviously a member of the Democratic Party, yet he's hawkish on the war. So do we know if any of these far-right wingers had any ties to Johnson, or if they were just sort of tolerating him until a real change could be made?
Long term, they wanted a Republican. They wanted Goldwater to win in '64. And I'll tell you, I have two firsthand anecdotes that tend to convince me that LBJ was not as involved as people say he was. First of all, have you ever heard my Fletcher Prouty story about Copa 94?
I have not, no, but I'd love to.
Okay. Well, he's, of course, the originator of the Key Bono, who benefited, therefore they must be guilty bullshit. LBJ became president, so he benefited, therefore he must have done it. It's like ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Well, Prouty, in 94, came back from lunch drunk. At least I think he had to be drunk to say what he said. And he goes, I'll bet you folks didn't know this, but my friends and I, it looks like my friends and I taught those Kennedys a thing or two about who really runs this country. The whole crowd gasped in unison. Huh? Who do they think they were? How many generations of Kennedys are there in America? 2 or 3? And they made their money on liquor and drugs, and they were prostitute, whatever. They had multiple affairs when they were married. I can trace my family back 10 generations to Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower, and everybody's going, well, not everybody, but everybody's going, my God, this guy is like a eugenicist or a white supremacist, and this is the first time he's ever dumping on the Kennedys. Who do they think they are? My friends and I taught them a thing or two about who really runs this country. So that means everything he ever said was total baloney until he said that. Meaning he made up his own conspirators. He made up his own story. Even a guy on Jerry Rose's Third Decade from Canada analyzed some of his claims in Robert Morrow's and his made in various books, and he said they're all lies. Robert Morrow and Fletcher Prouty are total liars. He couldn't have read this newspaper in Australia 8 hours after he forgot about the time zone. It was literally 6 or 8 hours after Kennedy was killed. He claims all this stuff was in an Australian newspaper, and it's just not possible. So that's number one. Meaning Prouty's Key Bono baloney was all made up. And number two was the fact that a naval commander inside Air Force One, just before the swearing-in ceremony, was asked to go find LBJ to be sworn in. And he goes, oh, where the hell is he? He locked himself in the bathroom. And he says, I went over, I knocked on the door. I said, Mr. Vice President, they're ready to swear you in. And then they go, well, what did he say? He goes, they're going to kill us all. They're here. I'm not coming out. They're going to kill us all. How do I know someone out there doesn't have a gun? And this was documented. I can't remember the commander's name, but it's like, that was like the first natural reaction. There's no way you can plan that. There's no way you can do it. He did not want to leave the crapper because he wasn't even convinced that Air Force One was secure and that everybody was one of the good guys. So I hate to say, you'll notice most of my writing and most of my focus is on the ground level, down and dirty, right-wing psycho extremists who are, have to be fascists, they have to be pro-Nazi, and they have to have lost something to the Russian Revolution that would make them millionaires or better if Kennedy was dead. And in '68, I was in Harvard Square when LBJ made his announcement of, I choose not to run. And not inside information, but general consensus in Harvard Square was that he was scared to the bones that he would end up like JFK if he couldn't kowtow to LeMay, and Lemnitzer and all the crazy ass generals. He didn't want anything to do with it. I mean, he may have done the Gulf of Tonkin, he may have, or may have embellished the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he may have played along for a while, but when people were talking about, I can't remember the guy who wanted to bomb North Vietnam back into the Stone Ages with a nuclear bomb, LBJ did not want to be president. He really didn't. And he resigned, and we're in a movie theater, and people were banging on the doors to give us the announcement to come out of the stupid movie theater. Everybody went out into the street, and everybody celebrated that. They hated him, but, they didn't know they were going to get worse. They were just happy that LBJ was quitting. So bottom line, I follow the leads, the ground broken by Bill Turner, who I respect and admire and met quite often and corresponded with him. Mae Brussel, I never corresponded with her. Dick Russell, Jerry Rose gave me my start with the first articles. I just never went down the LBJ did it route. And I never had enough personal information to go down that route. And yes, I blame the Catholic Intelligence Agency, but not to the extent that other people do. Some people were telling me Frank Wisner was the head of the thing, and then I saw a posting on the old bulletin boards. Yeah, but unfortunately, Frank Wisner was confined to a mental institution during the months of October and November. He didn't even have a phone in his room, So I'm going like, what kind of baloney is this? Frank Wisner was hospitalized. Or I can't think of the guy who was in Italy when the crime went down from the CIA. I said, oh, so what did he do? He controlled everything over long-distance phone calls, I'll think of his name in a while, but it's like one of the late additions to the guilty list. So that's my position on LBJ.
One last item that I found in your writing, and it may or may not be related to this, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. You made a comment about the real Indiana Jones.
Oh, yeah, right. Carlton Coon. Go look up the guy. Ironically enough, his last name is spelled Coon, C-O-O-N. He was a Harvard-trained anthropologist. He was stationed in Egypt with the OSS. He worked towards the assassination plot against Hitler. He was good with a bullwhip. He had his own pistol, and it's like he also was involved with, I think Indiana Jones was involved somehow with, in one of the movies, flying saucers, unidentified flying objects, occult. He was involved with the occult. No one can say it, but I have never found anyone who was a better match to the real Indiana Jones. You Google him, check it out, look at his background. He is he's a perfect match, just like my Big Daddy Warbucks to Wycliffe. And I will I'll go to my grave telling you that Carlton Coon was the guy they used as a prototype for Indiana Jones.
Well, it is an absolutely interesting theory, and I'll definitely check him out. But if anybody out there wants to find out more information about you or your research or where they can buy the book, how can they do so online?
I'm a member of about a half a dozen of the Facebook posting sites, but of course, the best way is I should have mentioned the manuscript before. JFK, The Final Solution, is my Amazon, Kindle, and Nook title. And I honestly believe it lays out a case matching exactly what we've been talking about today. And there are very few, if any, holes in the premise. But I'd ask them to buy it in their favorite media. Not many people do Kindle or Nook anymore. And I'm thinking of adding a couple new chapters to the manuscript in the next 3 months, or I may just do a separate 20-pager on everything that I've discovered in the last 10 or 15 years that may not have made it into the book yet, including Roy Hargraves and his Raleigh phone call guy. And I think everybody's waiting with bated breath for that. And, I hate to say it should crack the case wide open, but people are so fixed in their ways, I'm not convinced that it'll help anybody change their mind. But JFK, The Final Solution, is also referenced and named because it's based on, just like Ruby said and everybody else said, anti-Semites, fascists, and Nazis who would like nothing better than to roll back the clock and go into the eradication or vaporization of anyone who's Jewish. So that's the long and the short of it. Thank you for having me on your program.
And this has been John Bevilacqua, the author of JFK, The Final Solution. You can find it at Amazon, or we have a link to it on MidnightRiderNews.com, so you can go there and check it out as well. So, John, I want to thank you very much for being on. It was a fascinating 2 hours. It's a real interesting theory. It's a unique theory. And thank you very much for spending the time with us tonight.
Thank you.
I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is St. John Hunt, author of Bond of Secrecy, My Life with CIA Spy and Watergate Conspirator E. Howard Hunt, and Dorothy, an amoral and dangerous woman, the murder of E. Howard Hunt's wife, Watergate's darkest secret. For more on these topics, listen to episode 29 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
It's been a long show, and I don't want to take up any more of your time this evening. I'm truly appreciative that you chose to spend the evening with us, and it's really kind that you believe in us. We certainly believe in your right to be taught another way, a way that is very different than any of us have been taught in school, so consider this a free education. But as always, do your own research, and as I say often, vote with your dollars, your pounds, your yen, or your favorite currency of choice. But buy the books. Buy the show merchandise, make the donations, and help your favorite alternative media sources carry on. We are by nature outfunded, and we only have each other. And I'm not just talking about Midnight Rider News, I'm talking about all of your favorite alternative sites and shows. We have some exciting things scheduled for June, and we can't wait to spend more of these late nights together. So from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
You can contact ST Patrick by email at midnightridernews@gmail.com. Join us on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. Follow ST Patrick on Twitter at MWN_ST Patrick. We are LinkedIn at S.T.Patrick. And don't forget to follow Midnight Rider News on your YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and many of your favorite podcast providers. This has been a production of MidnightRiderNews.com and ST Patrick. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. We'll see you next time, and be good to the night.